Well, thank you very much. One of mine and Dan Galani's favorite songs. Hey, Bulldog. And you can talk to me, and you can also talk with Dr. Stephen Pieczenik here in just a minute. I told you I'd sprinkle in a couple of little news things. I'll do them very quickly. Here's a couple from my one of my favorite little websites other than coasttocoastam.com. This is from Full Spectrum Dominance. If you ever want to look at it, just put a dash between full and spectrum and between spectrum and dominance. It's a nice site. You'll like it. Half of youngsters would swap privacy for, yes, cheaper insurance. More than half of UK youngsters think being tracked is a small price to pay for cheaper car insurance, and 26% will be actively seeking a pay-by-the-mile policy in the hope of saving a few quid. This is slightly disturbing. Actually, I spoke with our friend Alex Jones on his program earlier today, and we discussed a little bit of this. Military says no presidential authorization needed to quell civil disturbances. This is an article by Paul Watson. A recent Department of Defense instruction alters the U.S. code applying to the military's involvement in domestic law enforcement by allowing U.S. troops, to quell civil disturbances domestically without any presidential authorization, greasing the skids for a de facto military coup in America, along with the wholesale abolition of posse comitatus. This is a real thing. And you know what they say about religion and politics. If you want to get people into an argument, just start with that. But we tried to discuss issues here that affect Americans. I don't care what party you belong to. It's true, the ones who get it, and the ones who don't get it are probably never going to get it. But I have hope. I have hope, and in fact, more than hope, I have faith that if the disbelievers and the deniers can be shown the truth and somehow persuaded to do their own research so that they can formulate their own opinions instead of repeating things like a bloody parrot, then we might be able to straighten this thing out. But the game is well underway, and we're pretty far behind. So, as ship's Captain Norrie says, as long as I'm allowed to sit in this chair, I'm going to try and bring it to you within the parameters of good taste and within the parameters of what we like to do on Coast to Coast AM. Remember, the truth is out there, and we're going to bring it in here every chance that we get. We'll be right back with Dr. Steve Pieczenik in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Steve Pieczenik, you speaking of 24-hour days and causing stress and all that, just looking over your career here, you were actually at the, in 1978, you were actually at the secret meeting when the Camp David Accords were signed, and I'm seeing you were a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under Kissinger, Cyrus Vance, and James Baker. You joined the U.S. State Department as a consultant to restructure its Office for the Prevention of Terrorism. I mean, this just goes on and on. It's almost a phone book. It's how in the world? I just have to know what led you into this field, because it seems like it started out. I mean, this may be a little understated, maybe a lot, maybe even juvenile, but it seems like you started out sort of with a political bent, but simultaneously you were full immersion into medical research, and you have degrees from Cornell and Harvard. I mean, where do you find the time, man? And how did you wind up with this list of credentials?
Oh, John, it's very kind of you. It's really not complicated. I didn't work 24/7. What happened is I grew up with a European background. I was born in Cuba, not because I'm Cuban, but because my father was in the French Army. My family was destroyed in the Holocaust, and my sensibilities were that of coming out of horror, terror. My first memories are really of eating with prisoners of war who were Germans, and destroyed France in 1945 and 46. When I came to the States, I was very fortunate. I grew up in Harlem, actually actually, and went to Booker T. Washington, and I had a scholarship to Cornell, and then from there I was able to get to Cornell Medical School. But I always knew that I would become a psychiatrist and a writer. It was always the notion that the refugee really understands the beauty and the greatness of this country, perhaps sometimes without offending anybody than the American does himself. And as a refugee who was welcomed by this country, I was able to do all the things that I had dreamed of doing, to become a doctor, and then I'd become a psychiatrist. But I knew I'd wanted to apply it to international affairs. Now, 30, 40 years ago, that was never heard of. And fortunately, while I was at Harvard, which was okay, not a good, particularly phenomenal school, but really I had more time than one could believe. I went to MIT at the same time and got a PhD from very unusual professors who really understood 30, 40 years ago that there was a natural integration between psychiatry and political science. And there was a very famous author who most people wouldn't know today, but I had met him, was named Harold Laswell, who in 1929 had written a book called Politics and Personality, and predicted that there would be a psychiatrist working as a strategist and a tactician in the State Department. And that's what I became. I got a Council on Foreign Relations Fellowship. I was brought on board by Lawrence Eagleberger, a very distinguished and great man who died recently. And my job at the time, and also I was in the military, so I had I had the rank of a colonel, because I was a medical doctor, but I advanced very quickly, where I was able to work on the Soviet Union and the regime change in the Soviet Union, because I had experience in the Soviet Union creating strategic points of tension within the Soviet Union that I could bring out dissidents, particularly Christian dissidents in the 1970s who were being hospitalized by the KGB with a diagnosis that was called chronic schizophrenia. And I wrote about that in a novel called The Mind Palace, which was one of my first novels, because I wanted to explain to the American public and the world how the Soviet system was really a totalitarian system, how they were using psychiatry to incarcerate political dissidents. And that was the beginning of my knowledge of how to take down the Soviet Union. And at the same time, I had the grateful opportunity. Larry said, take over, reorganize what you need to, and gave me a free rein. And as a doctor, you really have the capacity to deal with uncertainty and with crises. That's true of many doctors who've worked in the emergency room. And when we work 24/7 from Friday to Monday night, we don't do that now. You get that expertise of being able to make decisions very quickly in a time of crisis. So there was a very famous siege of Washington at the time called the Hanafi Muslim siege, where a Muslim took over 3-4 different buildings with 500 hostages, and I was fortunate to be called in. The FBI called me in, and the U.S. Attorney, Earl Silbert, called me in, and I used the Quran as a way of manipulating the mind of the terrorist at that time. He was called a terrorist. But I had a lot of respect for him, and over 35 hours, I was able to help release 500 hostages without any damage. But I did have to be defiant, and that's one of the things that I've always said to our military when I used to teach them at the National War College, that even though I was in the military and I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, my commitment to the lives of those hostages, and as an American, my loyalty was to the office of the presidency, and my job was to get them out, even though President Carter had ordered me to stand down. I refused to stand down, and I was insubordinate. But in being insubordinate, I was able to save some lives, and I was subsequently known as somebody who could be insubordinate, get things done. It sounds more fascinating than it is. I was just acting as a physician, and I had a moral obligation. And then from then on, when Jimmy Carter got involved in the Iran hostage siege, I resigned and thought he was very incompetent in the handling of that. And I went to the Rand Corporation, where I was asked to develop the architecture plan for the takedown of the Soviet Union, and I spent a year and a half developing about 160 pages using psychological determinants of how we could take down the Soviet Union without any military weapons. And we did, using the economy, the Pope, religion, rock and roll. And it was done with the help of, at that time, some famous...
How big a component was SDI and all that, Steve?
Yes, SDI was an important component. Reagan was a very bright individual in terms of foreign policy. What he understood was that we needed what I called the monkey in the box phenomenon, something that was a phenomenon that the Soviets would be fearful of, but we could create and drive up the costs of their system, military system, and that was SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. And at that time, we didn't really have it. But Reagan was so good as an actor and as a president that it really forced the economy of the Soviet Union to bankrupt. And that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. It wasn't something they gave to us. It wasn't something that suddenly happened. It was a process that was undertaken initially by Brzezinski with covert operations in Afghanistan. It was continued under Reagan. It was really Bush Sr. who completed it. And the entire communist system was finished by the time Baker, myself, and Zelig were there, and the entire communist system came down. So it's not a question of brilliance, it's a question of really understanding psychological dimensions of national character. And that was a field of study that MIT was very, very strong in 30, 40 years ago. And what's ironic, John, and the audience, is that in 1973, to show you how far MIT was, I was already taking the course that was funded by DARPA and the CIA called The Internet and Social Media. That's 1973. And we had never seen the Internet, but already there was discussion then about the impact on a concept called social media. So Mark Zuckerberg and Silicon Valley really blowing their horns when in fact it was really developed by Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency as a way of beginning to understand what was going to happen in the 21st century. There was not a way to control people. It was really a way of beginning to understand what the future might look like. And so subsequently I left the government and I began as an entrepreneur starting up different companies, radio frequency identification, object compression video, and then this nutraceutical company and the pharmaceutical company. But believe it or not, you can only do this in America. So I agree with you, John. I just want to add that I'm exceedingly optimistic about where we are now, where we're about to go, thanks to George Murray, yourself, Alex Jones, and many others, because we are called the alternative media, but in fact we are the mainstream media. And everybody's beginning to understand that 9/11 is a false flag. The Osama bin Laden story was a false narrative that brought us to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now we're in a conflict that we had no reason to be in, Syria, where I had been. And so the people of America are wakening up, and I agree with you, John. I'm exceedingly optimistic, thanks to people like yourself and George Murray, and also the fact that we have the Internet and the fact that people are awakening and reading blogs and creating blogs, and they're beginning to understand how corrupt the IRS is, how corrupt our legislators are, how corrupt the White House is, irrespective of what's said. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's all right. You have large thoughts. I'm just taking all of this in. Let me. You know how you get across thin ice, don't you, Steve?
Yeah.
You just keep dancing, right?
Well, you got to. You have. You're right, John. Either you go through or you just keep going.
Well, yeah, and the thing is that there are many, many people out there that feel a deep sense of loyalty to President Obama. So let us just do this. Let's just not speak his name anymore. Let's not single him out because, frankly, with a few exceptions over the string of presidencies that we've lived through, they're the figurehead. They are the great Oz, and don't look behind the curtain. But psychologically speaking, I suppose the short answer is, well, they're true believers. Okay, I answered my own question before I even asked it. But when you have any administration that the standard answer, anytime something hits the fan and starts getting on everybody, and now all the media outlets are picking it up and they're running with it because we know that they do. Nobody is going to come on the evening news and say, well, today was a lovely day from coast to coast. And so, therefore, we're going to go straight to sports, and then we're going to show an old rerun of Leave It to Beaver, because there's absolutely nothing negative that happened, nothing traumatic that you need to know about. How do you reconcile such loyalty when the answers from virtually every department that screws up in government in Washington, D.C. is, I don't know. I don't know anything. I don't remember.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, how is it that people get that mindset? And again, I don't want to pick on the president, because I'm not convinced that he's pulling on the strings. In fact, I'm convinced he's not pulling any of them. Actually, I think he just goes out and tries to do his thing, keep things going. But behind the scenes, we just went through a litany of how powerful the corporations are, what a huge influence money is. Well, we all knew that. I just don't think that any of us were aware that it was being wielded as a weapon against us, with these corporate interests being what they are. How do you persuade people to just look at the facts? Just abandon the fact that, let's pick on Angelina for a minute. Angelina makes great movies. I enjoy her movies. But I'm not going to say that I think that this thing with the double mastectomy was necessarily the way to go. The timing is certainly suspect with all these publications coming out, and then you heard what Mike Adams said, and the rest of the nation did too. So how do you persuade people to look at facts and just sort of let the personality that they adore just take back burner to that?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. One of the ways, number one, I would disagree with you a little bit in that he's far more active than people would imagine. But two, what is created is a narrative. It's a narrative of the republic or a particular administration. That I agree with, John. And the way you persuade people is you create a counter-narrative and you show the inconsistencies in the narrative. For example, 11 years ago, when it was proclaimed that Osama bin Laden on 9/11 attacked the World Trade Center, I came out on the 12th of September, and I said that's a lie. I created a specifically what was called cognitive dissonance. I created a point of fact that either you believe me or not, and I said the following. Not only is he not alive, he's dead, but he has Marfan syndrome. That has to be a medical fact. I didn't make it up. I knew his medical records from the 1980s. And by the way, this was 11 years ago. I said 9/11. By the way, there was a doctor from the CIA who went to see him at the request of President Clinton in Dubai. So that point of fact came in. Most people derided me. They said I was right-wing, I was nuts, I was wacky, just leave me alone. The problem was that 11 years later, as we know a year ago, when Obama decided, and I made a prediction 11 years ago, and this is the point about creating cognitive dissonance that break people's belief systems. I knew specifically from my experience in covert operations and having worked with the CIA and the DIA and other groups, that they would use the Osama bin Laden narrative in order to justify a war that was coming in. So I predicted two things. One, that there would be a war in Iraq that came a year later. But more importantly, I went on thin ice, as you said, John, and I said that war in Iraq will end the day whoever will be president will declare that he killed Osama bin Laden. Well, once you put that narrative as a counter-narrative to Osama bin Laden 9/11, 11 years ago, and Alex Jones picked me up 10, 11 years ago, and then replayed it 10 years later, 11 years later, when in fact Obama declared, Obama, killed Osama bin Laden, and suddenly you hear the tapes of Dr. Steve Pieczenik, whoever he may be. It's not relevant who I was. But the fact that he was a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and predicted that some president would come forth, it created a counter-narrative to what Obama had said.
Gotcha. All right, Steve, we got to stop for a minute. We'll be back with Dr. Steve Pieczenik on Coast to Coast AM. John Wells in for Ship's Captain George Norrie. Yes, indeed. If you go to coasttocoastam.com, which you should do every chance you get, certainly once a day, in the news you'll find new fracking rules proposed for U.S. land. That's from the New York Times. How humans will evolve over the next million years. The Internet, a superhighway of paranormal hoaxes and fake lore. That's from the Huffington Post. And the tallest abandoned structure in Russia. And while we're talking about Coast to Coast AM, thanks for becoming a Coast Insider. A valuable service, 3 years of archive shows, very inexpensive, a service I'm sure you will like. We'll carry on with your telephone calls as we make our way through the night. Sitting in for George Norrie tonight, I am John B. Wells, and we will be right back with our guest, Dr. Steve Pieczenik. This is Coast to Coast AM. Steve, let's segue over to an item that I wanted to bring up with you. I understand that you have some insight into the security services, specifically the CIA and mind control. Is this are these techniques? Can you discuss any of them, and are they being deployed now?
Well, I could discuss the issues of mind control. That was done in the 1960s and 1970s by many physicians at Cornell, Harvard, and different areas. I was not into that specifically. Most of the issues of mind control, brainwashing, had to do with the techniques that cults use or have been used or being used to torture and interrogation, which unfortunately has been committed under three presidents, Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama. And what happens in effect is you stir up the individual by depriving him or her of sleep. You decrease their nutrient intake so they're barely eating. And basically, you break it down, their physical and mental capacity. You make sure they're awake most of the time so that there's an incredible need for sleep and they have sleep deprivation. And then you constantly give them other messages which make them supportive of a false interrogator, a false image like a father figure in a cult group, or the good guy in an interrogation versus the bad guy. Those techniques were used very heavily in the 50s, 60s. Unfortunately, they were used through the torture system, but not necessarily mind control, but it was called interrogation or enhanced interrogation and torture. I myself have never used it. I'm not a great believer in it. I don't think it's ethical. And most of the time in the covert operations that I was involved in, which were many, I didn't need to be abusive or in any way interrogate anybody along the lines of a guy like Jose Gonzalez, who claimed he was happy to torture or mind control 30 out of 100 so-called terrorists. The truth is, when you discuss an issue or you question a person, it's much easier to make friends with them and create a relationship than to create a tabula rasa or an empty brain, which you then manipulate.
Before I forget to ask you again, are you giving us MDIHealth.com?
No, it's NDI, Nancy Boy India. NDI, Nutritional Biochemistry Inc., HEALTH.com, NDIHealth.com. November
Bravo India Health?
Yeah, health.com. Yeah, or they call up a number. It's 800-624-1416. That's 800-624-1416. That's Nancy Boy India Health.com.
Oh, well, no wonder I couldn't pull it up. But this isn't the most wonderful telephone connection that we've heard, isn't it funny how calls from overseas are so much clearer? It's extraordinary.
Well, I have to apologize, John. I'm on a cell phone. I don't have a hard line, and usually it's easier for you to have someone on the hard line. So I do apologize to you and your audience for that.
Oh, no worries. I just want to make sure they got your website out. It's like I kept going, well, it's not coming up. I wonder if we busted his server. Okay. All right, that's November Bravo India Health.com. You can take a look at it there. Would you care to speculate on some of these things that have been going on around the country? I'm looking at the the short list that I have here of what you do when you want to break somebody down. So I'm thinking TV news that raises the stress and you can't sleep. Then you feed them GMOs, which knocks the health down. Then you have the rescuing parent, which would be the government. I guess I'm reaching here, but why not?
John, but, in some ways, the truth is much simpler. I mean, if you look up, for example, Anderson Cooper in Wikipedia, and he went to Yale, it says right there he was an intern at the CIA. So when Anderson Cooper gives you a scoop about Benghazi, which is totally a lie, you know he's working for two organizations, CNN and the CIA. I mean, that is not hard to deduce. That's part of the issue that you brought up very well, John, to your audience, that daylight is coming. You just have to be able to empower yourself to look up the various elements on the Internet, and you find out, oh, my God, Anderson Cooper was in the CIA or maybe worked with the CIA. That's kind of a revelation, but it's right there in Wikipedia. So when he comes with a scoop, you become very skeptical. So the narrative, again, you asked me, how do you break the narrative? So the media narrative suddenly is broken when there's an inconsistency. For example, when they talked about Benghazi, Wolf Blitzer, Anderson Cooper, and they had inside scoops, none of which were related to the truth. Number one, there wasn't an embassy there. Number two, it really wasn't a consulate. What it was a bunch of houses or rooms where the CIA and ex-special forces were really interrogating prisoners illegally and were shipping armaments to Syria. Well, that didn't come out in the Benghazi reports. That didn't come out in the Pickering Oversight Committee. None of that came out. What the narrative that came out was, there weren't enough regional security officers. Well, that's a lie, because if you know the narrative that the person, you don't happen to know that, but I happen to have known the person who resigned was Eric Boswell, whom I've worked with for 20, 30 years. He was director of the security office, regional security officers all over the world. You know he's a very loyal, methodical, effective individual, and he resigned not because he was ineffective, there weren't enough security officers, but because he had to cover the lies of the State Department and the lies of the White House on Benghazi. The second narrative that came out was that there was a viral video that went viral, and that was broken very quickly. And so you're correct, John, and the audience is beginning to understand that immediately you can break a narrative by beginning to investigate the so-called statements in very fast time. And that's why I'm optimistic, and that's why I'm happy to be on your show to say to the audience, look, it sounds depressing, it sounds like darkness has descended upon us, but the truth is it really is a new time, and it's a new revolutionary period where we are beginning to use information, self-empowerment, the George Noory, the Alex Jones shows, the John Wells, all of those people are important to us in understanding the message. It's time for you, or me, the American citizen, to begin to empower him or herself by learning what the issues are, by taking some time out, questioning what the statements are, both mine and whatever somebody else says, and then doing something about it. You don't have to write a check. You don't have to run out and shoot a gun. What you do have to do is start to write to your friends, to your senators, to your congressmen, and put pressure on your legislators. And by God, look what happens. You suddenly get an IRS investigation. Then the Associated Press wakes up and says, they're stealing information from us. Good God, what do you think you've been there? I mean, an axiom, quite frankly, of the CIA and any intelligence organization was this, and this axiom was always true, and that is that reporters and information sources were used for disinformation. That was part of the covert world. And so for the Associated Press to suddenly wake up and say, oh, my God, we've been raped, it's very much like saying you've been in a bordello and you're telling me that you didn't know that you were there to service the various individuals and you can't be righteous about it. So I have no pity, although I'm shocked that they were stupid enough to do this. But, in fact, most reporters and and most journalists have to have access to the government. In order to have access to the government, they literally have to quote, I have to put it up, suck up, or be able to offer themselves in some way, become vulnerable to the person giving them information. And that is a two-way street. It's symbiotic between government officials and reporters. So for reporters to suddenly become self-righteous and say, my God, I was raped by the government, that's a little bit over the top. The truth of the matter is that reporters have a very symbiotic relationship with government officials, and government officials in turn become reporters or utilize them. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship, but disinformation is part of that relationship. So that's very important for the American public to understand. That the people in the covert world of the security will have no qualms about disseminating disinformation. As you would say, John, that's brainwashing or someone else. And in the covert world, they would say, well, that's propaganda. And every administration where you're correct, John, is that it doesn't matter whether it's Obama, Clinton, or Bush, or any other president. They each had a narrative that they wanted to be remembered with. And in this case, Obama had a narrative that was the Obamacare, and I've done the following, and so and so. But the reality is that so many realities have come forth because of the Internet, because of the immediacy of crises, because of Syria, because of Benghazi, because of the IRS, that suddenly with technology and a certain amount of awareness, people are saying, wait, that narrative doesn't work. So the narrative changes. But the people who are in government haven't changed. John Brennan, who was head of counterterrorism for Obama and was involved in the so-called assassination of Osama bin Laden, which was a fake narrative, and then was involved in covert operations in Iraq with the drone wars, which were illegal and killed 348,000 people. He's not accountable. He was made director of the CIA. So the narratives continue. They may be disrupted, but what's not disrupted is the fact that the American people have not held any of our officials accountable. For example, and you know this to be self-evident, none of our bankers, despite the travesties and criminal activities that Goldman Sachs committed, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America have all committed, not one banker has been put in prison, including Corzine, who was a former senator and governor of New Jersey, and he had MF Global that went under, and he destroyed the contracts of 40,000 farmers of Montana, yet he was not put in prison. Goldman Sachs that bet against their own security mortgages and shorted them. In other words, destroying their own assets in order to make money twice, were never accused, were never put in prison, even though they were questioned by Senator Levin, who said this is criminal. J.P. Morgan Chase, questioned by Senator Levin. So the American public has not really demanded that there be an accountability and prison. Prison for officials and prison for those who've committed the acts of criminals. And once that's gone, the system says, you know what, nobody cares. So there's no accountability for a government official. It doesn't matter whether it was Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, or Cheney. They go away, they write their novels, or they write their autobiographies, which really amount to novels, and they go on to make a fortune.
Isn't that true? Isn't that they do amount to novels, don't they? You know, on Friday night, Steve, we always take some calls. There's several people who would like to speak with you. If you're all right with that, we'll take a call right now. Let's talk to Rand out of New York on wildcard line number 2. Rand, if you're still there, thanks for holding, and come on.
Hey, guys. I moved to New York from Austin, Texas a couple of years ago, and I was in Austin, and 9/11 happened in 2001. And I always knew it was a lie. I mean, from the minute they were finding the passports and the rubble and, building number 7 going down, global symmetrical collapse at free fall speed. I mean, it was like, wait a minute, why isn't this being shown on television? It's the strangest anomaly the whole day, this 47-story building that just happened to have the biggest, CIA office outside of Langley, comes crashing down at free fall speed, and they don't even show it on television. I moved to New York 2 years ago, and I'm just completely blown away by how many people in this city don't know about building number 7, the third building to fall. I mean, my own doorman here doesn't know. And, I just wanted you to expand on your statement that you thought it was a lie, Steve. I would really like to hear you tell us, who you think was behind it.
I've said it from day one who was behind it. It was a stand down. There was no secret. I mean, 40% of the American public, other than New Yorkers, now know it. George Bush needed a raison d'etre or a reason to go to war, which he already concocted way before he came in with the neocons, Wolfowitz, Steve Hadley, Richard Pearl, Zalmay Khalilzad, all the guys I've worked with and didn't agree with them, including Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. They created what was called a stand down, where they allowed planes to come in, and they created a situation where the World Trade Center and several other buildings were destroyed. But again, the narrative here doesn't work, as you pointed out. Only a good Texan from Austin could tell, again, that the buildings, all you have to look is the engineering requirements, that buildings can't collapse in 8 seconds. You don't have explosions every 20 feet, and no planes can destroy an individual building. But I said it then that this was a false narrative that was used to create a purpose to go to war in Iraq, where we failed, and again, where we went to war in Afghanistan, where we failed, and where Bush Jr. as well as Clinton both created this narrative about the war on terror, which is an oxymoron, because in the world of psychology, and I was one of the first counterterrorist experts, you don't create a war on an emotion. Terror is an emotion. I can create terror without even destroying anything. The fact is, the attack on 9/11 was not a terrorist attack. It was an act of war, which is very different from a terrorist attack. A terrorist attack is when I create fear, and I resonate that fear through the media, like Boston Massacre, which was a disaster of handling by both the White House, the Mueller, the FBI, where there was literally a lockdown of a town of 4 million people. That's an act of terror. An act of war is where you literally go to war. And Bush was so stupid, and so were the people in the CIA. No, I mean it. I mean, if you're going to have a narrative, you got to be smart about your narrative. If you want to write a novel, and that's really what a narrative is. Bush Jr. and Cheney are not very bright. I've known Cheney and Rumsfeld since the Nixon days. These are not the brightest individuals. They are lethal, and they are ruthless. They have no qualms about killing 3,000 of our Americans in order to go the war for the military-industrial complex, in this case oil, and Iraq. Iraq wasn't relevant to them. Saddam Hussein was just an excuse, and the rest is commentary. But the narrative was very simple. Now, the question that you asked specifically is, why don't people want to believe it? When you change your belief, you have to take responsibility. And to take responsibility for defying a government, particularly the American government, where we say, God bless America, and I stand for the Republic, is very, very hard for an individual to do, particularly on 9/11. Despite the fact that you were aware of it, and many others, that there was an inconsistency and a logic in the narrative, and it didn't make sense, most people had to come to the conclusion that, look, my government could never do this. And this was true about people close to me, both friends and family members, who really didn't want to listen to it. And for years, I really had to kind of go away and be kind of a renegade of the family or the Washington, D.C., because I wasn't there to just proselytize. I was there to call the cry for freedom, to say, look, this is the beginning of a very disastrous cycle of events that will occur in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and created by the CIA, for the CIA, and military intelligence. I can give you a whole list of names and units that were involved, but that's been said before. But the question then became, well, what do we do about it? Have we brought Bush Jr. to justice? No. Have we brought Cheney to justice? No. Have we brought Condoleezza Rice to justice? No. Colin Powell, who said in front of the UN and to the world, look, I have anthrax in my hand in a bottle. He was clearly lying. But I've known Colin Powell for 20 years. He's lied for 20 years.
Steve, hang with us for another half hour or so, will you?
Sure, no problem.
We're going to take some more calls, and then after that, it's all you. John B. in for George Norrie tonight. This is Coast to Coast AM. We shall return.